Yeah, just say when, and I'll start you up. Rock and roll. Okay. This guy's a little too close. All right, well, let's start with a word of prayer and kind of get into this. Gracious God, we are so thankful we can gather together to look at the evidence for your existence, look at the many proofs that show that you indeed exist, Lord, and we should not just take you not seriously and with a heart that's not ready to receive you, but rather to spend our lives focused on you and thanking you for sending your Son to die for all of our sins. So, Lord, we pray that this discussion and time we have together would be fruitful and beneficial for your church, and it would help people understand the reasons for why you exist. Thank you, God, for this time. It's in Jesus Christ's name we ask all these things. Amen. Well, I thank a few of you brave travelers going through the snow here. I know it's kind of like dicey out here in Utah. So that's kind of why we decided in the final analysis to live stream these in case there are kind of weather happenings like this. And I'm from Southern California, so when I drive in snow, it's really dicey. So there's that. So yeah, the people have asked me, so like why am I doing this series on proofs for God's existence? You know, I mean, I've spent the past 18 years looking at the evidence and arguments for God's existence. So why have I done all this? Well, I think kind of giving you guys a little bit just for the first time, my background and kind of how I became a Christian, started believing in God, all these things, will kind of explain why I've had such a deep fascination in the big questions. And I think the biggest question is whether or not God exists. So I grew up in a church family, and it was, you know, my family was nominally Christian. They went to church sometimes, sometimes not. And when they did go, I recall distinctively, my experience was absolutely hating church. It was an awkward experience, and especially the time where everybody had to like go greet your neighbor or hold hands. And I just like, oh no, don't want any part of that. So I would escape church as much as I possibly could. So as a teenager, you know, I was, I liked certain ideas about theism, about God, about Christianity. But generally, if I'm being honest with you, I was pretty skeptical about the existence of God, very skeptical about God's existence. And so I think what I liked about Christianity was the idea of like good and evil and there being this conflict. I appreciated that quite a bit. I liked that part of it, but probably some of the moral demands I didn't like as much. And so what I did during my high school, I chose to remain very skeptical about the existence of God. And I chose to live my life any way I wanted at that point, just kind of living a very hedonistic kind of existence. And so, but that changed. That changed when I was on the cusp of when I was turning 20 to 21. I actually heard a debate on the existence of God between an atheist and a minister who was also a philosopher. And I heard, you know, my ideas coming into the debate was like, oh man, this Christian's going to get totally wasted. Oh, there's no reason to believe in God or anything like that. And what I found was the opposite. I listened to the debate, and the Christian pastor and philosopher presented clear arguments for the existence of God, from the uniformity of nature, for morality, from the laws of logic, and to trying to argue that all of that's grounded in a divine mind and will and a goodness of, and it was just such clear arguments that were all stringed together, and the atheists had no response to these arguments. And it blew me away how clear they were, and how the atheists could not provide any sort of decent response, or any response at all for that matter. And so I heard like, wow, God exists. Well, that kind of changes my life a little bit, you know. So I decided to look more into this, and I shortly after gave my life to Christ, looking at the arguments and reading through the Bible. And it changed, I mean, if I'm being honest, it changed the entire trajectory of my life, changed the entire like flow of, I mean, I'm a pastor now in Draper, Utah, like, if you would have told me that when I was 18, I would have never believed you. Like, that just seems so surreal to me that I could be a pastor, given how I used to be and used to live and used to think. And so hearing these arguments is what caused this major just shift in my life, this major transformation in how I lived my life, how I treated people. And so I went afterwards to study at college at Biola University, got my MDiv at Westminster, and then I also spent, during that time, getting my second master's degree in philosophy, religion, and ethics at Biola University. So this whole time I've been kind of investing into these arguments because this is what caused me to get interested in this in the first place. And so, I think these questions really strike at the heart of who we are, why we're here, the purpose of our existence. I cannot even conceive or think of a bigger reason for why we exist, than God's existence. That is that is the biggest philosophical question to me. It's like, think of the movie Prometheus, which is probably not ever quoted in any sort of church, but it's like a prequel to Aliens, But this guy who's searching, it captures his desire to search out why he is here and why he has the creator, why the creators could have made him in that context. And that's the biggest question. Why are we here? Who is our creator? What does he want from us? Why did he create us? All of those questions strike at the very heart of everything, the purpose of our existence. But there's a problem that I've encountered transitioning from the kind of more academic world, studying the arguments for God's existence, especially in academia, and to the boots on the ground, on the streets, is that people literally have no idea whatsoever that there are actually an overwhelming amount of arguments for the existence of God. Like, people are totally, completely clueless. I have found that if you encounter the average skeptic on the streets, they will say, "Oh yeah, there's no evidence for God, and look at all this evil, and yeah, there's no way. This belief in God's totally unreasonable." And little do they know that the argument they're using, the problem of evil, is filled with so many problems of trying to do divine psychology as to why would God permit certain things to happen, and you're trying to do divine psychology, an infinite being, and it's just a wash. And so even atheists have said this problem of evil is very unsuccessful. It's one of, there's only 2 arguments against the existence of God, whereas there's 50 plus arguments for God's existence. And when you're kind of looking at the scales there, it's really overwhelming, the evidence, and the only arguments that atheists have are really arguments that depend on trying to get into the divine mind and do psychology on what an infinite being would allow or wouldn't allow. Why is he allowing this? Why did this happen? Why did this occur? And for a finite being to do divine psychology on an infinite being, it's a very fruitless endeavor, and that's why the problem of evil has kind of really fallen apart in my estimation. And so when you compare, there's kind of a growing field in Christian philosophy and theist philosophy, the arguments for God's existence, that God's doing pretty good in philosophy. And this is from an atheist philosopher, Quentin Smith. He states this well: "God is not dead in academia. He has returned to life in the 1960s and is now alive and well in his last academic stronghold, philosophy departments." No one thinks that. So you compare what Quentin Smith says to the average guy on the street who says there's no evidence for God's existence. I did this. I was just kind of curious about this, and I looked on the church Facebook, and here's some. We posted, 50 arguments for God's existence. We got a lot of comments in the section. People were making all sorts of colorful comments and everything. And this is what one skeptic remarked. He says, "Just one argument would do for me. But seeing as there aren't any real ones, I'll give it a miss. Thanks." So another gentleman remarked confidently, "There are none," referring to there are no proofs. "If there were evidence, atheism wouldn't exist. Everyone would believe because evidence." The reason this debate continues is because there is no proof. The failure of the theist to prove the claim is widely known. Apparently it's widely known. Everybody knows about it. See how people think? They just take these things for granted without knowing really what's going on at all, causing membership worldwide to dwindle. What's interesting about that is every statement he made is wrong, and that's in that whole little section there, because Atheism is dwindling, actually, but theism is growing worldwide. You can look that up on any survey and statistic. Atheism is a minority position. Very few people hold to it, as a matter of fact. And we're looking at the globe, and it's dwindling. Theism is growing faster than the human population by, I think, over times two, if memory serves. Here's what another gentleman said. If there was any proof, I'm pretty sure I would be aware of it. If there was proof, you wouldn't have to take any claim on faith. Totally misunderstanding the whole idea of what faith is. Faith is trust. I know my wife exists. We know we have relationships with friends that we know exist, but we have trouble trusting them. Even if I had an infallible proof, which I think I do, for God's existence, I would still have trouble trusting him because it's a relationship and you can have trouble with trusting, which is what faith is, even if you know something exists, like a friend, like a spouse, and so on. Don't take from that I don't trust my wife, by the way. That could be misconstrued the wrong way. I wasn't saying that. So here's my goal. And this, as I've encountered these types of people who think there are no reasons to believe that God exists, this is kind of what I've set out to do, is I want to offer 50 of the most, because there's more. I mean, you can go on videos and type in 100 arguments, and you can see there's more than 100 arguments for God's existence, that kind of thing. But my goal here, because some of those arguments are so hard to understand, they're just going to, it's going to be like not as apparent to you. But I want to spend my time on the most well-known arguments and the clearest arguments for the existence of God that I can hopefully, prayerfully, going to need some prayer on this, put it into layman's terms, make it easy to understand so it's not just so high level that you're just like, oh, I have no idea what this guy is saying. So is my chin hitting the mic, by the way, guys? Okay, good. Mm-hmm. I feel something on my chin, and I'm just like worried I'm just hitting the mic excessively here. Never happens on Sundays, but... So yeah, I'm going to treat the most popular proofs, survey them, and I'll cover the main objections. Now, obviously, I can't cover every objection. There are probably 20, 30 articles on all the objections you can come up, or the counter responses from theists. So my goal is to survey each argument in a 30, 45-minute time period, and then open it up for questions here. You guys can walk up here and ask questions. Any question you have about the argument, don't be shy. Don't worry. You can ask me anything. I'm going to just kind of give an overall kind of survey of each argument, kind of present the general thrust of what the reasons are for thinking this argument is true or why it follows. And when I say it's a proof, I mean it's a logical argument. It's more reasonable than not to affirm. And so I'm not saying that every argument I give is going to be like given with 100% certainty, but it's more plausible than the alternative. I'm showing that each premise or proposition is more reasonable than not. So I'm arguing proof as in like it's a reasonable proof. It gives good evidence for the existence of God and for belief in God. So I'm going to give 50 of those, and I'm starting off with the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Now, for those of you who are here, who's heard of the Kalam Cosmological Argument? Anybody's heard? Okay. 2 people. Okay. So this is the word kalam is from an Arabic word which means speech, and it was defended by Islamic philosophers in the medieval time period, and now it is used by Christian philosophers primarily, and Christian scientists also use this argument. And the argument basically seeks to prove Genesis kind of 1:1 is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, what atheists have believed for the longest time is that there is no beginning, that time, or matter especially, is eternal. It goes on and on and on. It goes back and back and back. And so atheists have held to this eternal universe. Some people say, well, atheists hold to the Big Bang. Well, they recently have had to hold to a Big Bang because of the evidence, as we'll see. But historically, atheists have held that the universe goes back and back and back, and that matter is eternal. That's the idea. Now, this is one of the most popular, favorite arguments there is, that you can really come across. This is a very popular argument, and some would say it's one of the strongest and clearest arguments. Now, I don't believe that personally, but I figured I'd start off with the most popular one. I think it's a great argument. I think it's very good. I use it all the time. But me personally, what caused me to come to faith in Christ were a different set of arguments. But this is a great argument. And I know it is because I used to argue against it because I didn't think it worked for the longest time. But when you argue against it, you see that the arguments you have are not very good. I've come around on this argument. Now I use it pretty frequently. But this is what the Cambridge Companion to Atheism says. This was published in 2007 about the Kalam Cosmological Argument. It says, a count of articles in the Philosophy Journal show that more articles have been published about the Kalam argument than have been published about any other contemporary formulation of an argument for God's existence. Theists and atheists alike cannot leave the Kalam argument alone. So it's big deal of an argument here. People really like it. And so here's the argument's easy to memorize. It's just in 3 simple steps that it follows here. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, that's 1. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe, 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. I'll repeat it again. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, that's a pretty logical, airtight argument. It's definitely sound. It's valid. And then if you think the premises are true, then it's sound. And so it's if you accept 1 and 2, then 3 follows. And you can't say, well, I'm going to accept 1 and 2, and then I'm going to deny the conclusion. No, if it's a valid argument, it goes through. That's the idea. And so if we're able to show that 1 is true and 2 is true, then 3 follows. That's what a logical argument is like. That's what it looks like. And so what I'm going to say is just each one, I will say whatever begins to exist as a cause, that this is more plausibly true than not, and there's good reasons for it. So the first one, the first support for the first premise, which is whatever begins to exist has a cause. And this is pretty obvious. From something comes. From nothing comes, right? That seems pretty intuitive. And nothing just means a universal negation. Nothing is not anything. It's no thing. And to say that something can pop into existence without a cause, without anything, just pop into existence, that seems really bizarre and absurd. William Lane Craig, who defends this type of argument, says that believing that things can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing is really worse than believing in magic. At least when you have magic and you got the rabbit in the hat, he says. It's kind of funny how he always presents this, but he'll say at least when you have magic, you have the hat and you have the magician bringing the rabbit out of the hat. But when things just come into existence without nothing, it's worse than magic. It just comes into existence. It's worse than Harry Potter or whatever you think it is, right? So it's very bizarre, and it's just intuitive to us that a giant computer, or we've just had pizza, a giant pizza, or Corvette, or, I don't know, a million bats are just going to pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. We don't live that way. We don't expect, a giant turtle to pop into existence right here uncaused out of nothing. Because from nothing, nothing comes. From something comes. Seems pretty intuitive here, right? And I don't know what to tell you. If you expect a giant moose to pop into existence here uncaused out of nothing, then you should be really living in fear at that point. I don't know what to tell you. So, the second reason is that for affirming this premise is that if things can pop into existence without a cause, out of nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just any and everything can just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. Why don't we see it regularly? Why don't we see, on a regular basis, we see, a million people pop into existence uncaused, or Zeus or a genie pop into existence out of nothing, Why don't tigers, horses, babies, fire trucks pop? Because nothing is nothing. There doesn't have any properties or descriptive characteristics. There's nothing about nothing. So it's not like you can say, well, nothing is constraining it. Well, it doesn't constrain anything because it's literally nothing. So, I mean, why don't we expect things just to pop? Well, yeah, there's no explanation of that. And so it just becomes inexplicable. If we grant that things can come into existence out of nothing, why doesn't just any and everything come into existence uncaused out of nothing? And then, of course, I think this one is pretty obvious. Common experience. Common experience shows us that things don't just pop into existence uncaused out of nothing. I hope that's your experience. But, yeah, I mean, we look around, we do science, we don't expect things just to pop into existence and everything. That's not how, reality is not that way. And so that's why it seems like a basic foundational part of metaphysics, from nothing, nothing comes, from something, something comes. And so even like this guy, David Hume, who was just a radical skeptical guy. He was a Scottish skeptic, and he was a philosopher, and people say that he didn't believe in causation or didn't believe, in this sort of stuff. But even he said, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. I only maintained that our certainty of the falsehood of that proposition proceeded neither from intuition, sense experience, or demonstration, but from another source. So even Hume, who was very skeptical about uniformity and causation, said, no, I've never said anything so bizarre and crazy that things can just pop into existence without a cause. Some people attributed that to him, but even he, who was hyper skeptical, admitted that. So I think it's pretty reasonable. I don't think most people don't deny this premise. Usually, where all the action at is premise 2. Although I understand Alexander Melanchthon denies premise 1 because he believes in the Big Bang. So and also Quentin Smith thinks that basically that the universe came by nothing and from nothing. It just popped into existence, uncaused out of nothing. So there are people that do that. It's not particularly like a intellectually plausible alternative, but there are scientists and philosophers out of desperation who have to say that. So 2, the universe began to exist. And now we're going to get a little heady, but just try to stay with me. If you can't stay with me, that's okay. I'm going to try to break this down as best I can. But there are basically philosophical arguments that try to show that the past is not infinite, or as they would say, Buzz Lightyear, infinity and beyond. There's no infinity and beyond, right? But the past is finite. And so they try to show like it would be like absurd to have like this infinite past that goes on and on and on and on and on. And so the arguments try to show that that infinite past is absurd. And so there must be a beginning. And it can't go on and on. Another way of describing the kind of 2 options before us is the past composed of one event causing another event, and on and on and on to infinity, right? That's called causal infinitism there. The idea that, if you can imagine like dominoes just hitting each other, one hitting the other, hitting the other, hitting the other, causal infinitism would say that events are like that. And so you just look back into the past, any part of a timeline, and it would be one domino hitting another domino. You go back further and further, one domino. And so you keep on going back, and every time you're going back, there's just dominoes hitting dominoes. And it's infinitely extended off into the past. Hope you guys are with me. So that's causal infinitism there. And it's just never-ending amount of causes in the past, back and back and back and back and back and back. There's no beginning on that view. The other alternative is causal finitism. This is the idea that, you go back and back and back. The dominoes hit each other, right, and stuff. But someone starts the dominoes. You go back in the past enough, and there's someone starting them dominoes, or there's a starting point to the dominoes, better put, right? So, using that, there's a person starting them. Now, I'm going to give a lot of different reasons for thinking that it doesn't just go back and back and back, but it goes back and back and back, and then boom, there's a necessary starting point. That's the idea I want to defend. Now, one reason I want to give right away for just preferring, you have, causal infinitism, which goes back and back and back and back, or you have the causal finitism, which has a necessary stopping point, so it doesn't go back and back and back. There's one reason for just preferring causal finitism, and that is Occam's razor. This is a principle that's used both in metaphysics, philosophy, and science. It's used all the time, but you're not to posit entities beyond necessity more than you have to, or you prefer the simplest explanation. I think we all kind of believe this on some level. It's a very intuitive, accepted principle. But if I come home tonight, my wife has a big plate of steamy rice for me on my plate there, a bunch of rice. I'm using rice for a reason, trust me. Or let's just say fries. I feel like fries are easier because they're bigger, right? So I come back, after this, my wife's got a big plate of fries, which I prefer fries over rice. If you're confused with that, you could tell that I definitely prefer fries. And so I could say, okay, my wife made me all these fries, or I could say everybody in the church got together and maybe one fry each. Well, that's so complex, right? Why would I have to say, though I'm going to prefer the simplest explanation, just one person, my wife, put some fries in the oven and boom, I've got fries. Not that each individual fry was made by somebody else. So you prefer, in our own experience, we prefer sort of the simplest explanation of things. Just if my carburetor goes out in my car, I don't assume that it just ran out and it's old, and that a million invisible alien spacecraft shot it, and that's why it also went out. I just know I go with the simplest explanation. It got old and it wore out. Simple explanation there. So what's simpler, a finite past or an infinite past? Well, I can tell you this much. If you're having universes causing universes going back and back and back and back into just, a multiverse of causing one multiverse, you're going back and back and back. Well, we can see that's infinitely more complicated, infinitely more complex than a finite past. So just Occam's razor, just intuitively, we're going to want to give preference to the finite past view, not saying holding to a infinitely more complex theory and idea. That seems absurd. We never reason that way in our lives. Why make things more complicated? And so I would say the preference is going to be to causal finitism. Now, some people have some doubts here with this kind of stuff. They'll say like, well, Nate, isn't it true that when we're in heaven, we'll be worshiping God for an infinite amount of time? Isn't that the Christian view of heaven? That it's just an infinitely worshiping God? Well, no, that is called potential infinity. And the idea is that it goes on and on and on while never actually arriving at infinity. Because infinity is every natural number. You're not going to arrive at every natural number, every year, so you'll never reach all the numbers. You'll never arrive at infinity, but you're constantly progressing towards it. You're never arriving, but always progressing towards it while never hitting infinity. Infinity is just all the numbers. I mean, it's everything. So you can never arrive at that. And so that's an actual infinite. And so, yeah, obviously, we will go through, year one, decade one in heaven, decade two, in there for billions of years, 2 billion a year, all that kind of stuff. But we're never actually arriving at okay, we've been here for 10 million years. We finally arrived at it. No, that's not how it's going to work. And so it's potentially infinite, meaning it goes on and on and on. We'll never actually arriving at infinity, but all the numbers, not all the natural numbers are reached. And so that's the difference between a potential infinite and an actual infinite, which is a complete set of all the numbers, which will never be reached by anything. You can never actually get to it. That's another argument that people use. I'm going to try to summarize this. So here's the absurdity with actual infinites, okay? So this Muslim philosopher, Al-Ghazali, sought to try to heighten the impossibility of forming an actual infinite past here by giving kind of these illustrations and absurdities. And this one's my favorite. He says, okay, let us imagine our solar system here. Okay, say you have Mars and you have Earth, right? And Earth's orbiting around the sun twice a year. Or sorry, let's just say it's going around twice. Actually, it would be Mars. Let's just say Earth goes around twice a year. It doesn't, but we'll just postulate that, and say Mars goes around once, because I know Mars goes around at a slower rate, but we'll just, for simplicity's sake, we'll go with that. So Earth goes around twice around the sun in a year, and Mars goes around once, right? And they are at different rates, and the planets are at different orbits and everything like that. Now, say you have them going at different rates for an infinite past time, okay? And so you have an infinite past go by. What happens, and this is really interesting, which one has completed the most orbits? If an infinite amount of time has gone by, they go at different rates now, right? One's 1 and one's 2. Once a year, it's twice, and the other one's once, one orbit. Well, they're both infinite amount, right? They both have the same amount, same number, infinite amount of orbits, infinite number of orbits. And so, but yet, as time goes on, Mars gets infinitely behind Earth. And infinite time means it's infinite, it's infinitely behind. And so you have this absurd thing where they're the same exact numerical value, they're infinite, but Mars is actually infinitely behind Earth. Now, imagine that. That's absurd. And by the way, when they reached infinity, I wonder what number it was. Was it odd or even? That'll really keep you up at night thinking about that. Because with infinity, it's weird, right? So this is all the more reason to think that actual infinities don't exist in time and space and matter. Here's probably an easier example for you guys, a much more easier example. This one's one of my favorites to kind of show the absurdity of an actual infinite. So say you have a infinite amount of marbles, right? And I have an infinite amount and you have none of them. But things start getting weird when I give you only all the odd number marbles out of my infinite collection. But according to mathematics of the infinite, you and I both have an infinite amount of marbles. You have all the odd and I have all the even numbers. And as bizarre as it sounds, that's how infinity works. But now let us suppose that I gave you all of my infinite marbles, so I had an infinite amount of marbles, and I kept the first 5 marbles. You would have an infinite amount of marbles, that's what you would have, and I would have only 5. That's how infinity works. Isn't that crazy? So in each of these cases, I've given you an infinite number, but I've generated contradictory results. Completely contradictory result. I've given you identical amount of marbles and yet different results. And so this is just, it's absurd. Now, I have one that I particularly like that is kind of unique to me that I've actually, it's convinced me to think that actual infinites don't exist. And it shows you how bizarre my brain works, because this is like, you're going to think, wow, this is so strange. But there's a old philosophical paradox called Zeno's paradox. And basically, I guess I'll illustrate it with my bottle cap here. But okay, say I take this bottle cap and I throw it against that wall, right? In order for it to arrive at that, well, it's not wall, they're doors technically. They're sliding doors. In order for it to arrive there, it had to go half the distance, right? Had to go half the distance to reach that. But it had to go half of the distance to get there, right? And then it had to go half and the half. The point is, between any two spaces, you can divide it up infinitely. And so there's an infinite, according to Zeno, there's an infinite amount of points between these two. You can keep on dividing up into smaller intervals to infinity and beyond, as Buzz Lightyear would say. So then Zeno said, well, if there's an infinite amount of points here, how can an object go over an infinite amount of points in a finite amount of time? How is that possible? That's crazy. So what Zeno did historically was to deny the existence of motion. He didn't think motion existed. That guy's got problems, right? Well, you don't think motion exists, so he thought motion was an illusion. Now that's a pretty unsavory conclusion. Instead, you can just get out of it and say, well, there aren't actually infinite amount of points between these 2 points here. There isn't at all an infinite amount of points, but as a matter of fact, you can just potentially keep on dividing them up and never reach infinity and beyond. And so that's what I would say. There's not actually an infinite amount of points, but you can divide it up, and so on, and so on. So, I can go on for literally hours on all of these arguments and just bore you guys. There's so many problems with an actual infinite existing in space and time and matter. I mean, there's a Grim Reaper paradox that actually shows actual infinites are contradictory. not just metaphysically impossible, but complete contradiction. And then there's Bertrand Russell's paradox of Tristan Shandy. There's Hilbert's Hotel, which Craig uses all the time. William Lane Craig uses that one. Look, there are just so many, just tons of these problems, and the atheistic solutions are like, some of them are like, I can't even think about that, so hard, or they don't have very like clear or obvious solutions to these, and there's so many of these problems with these paradoxes with infinities. And so here's my parting salvo in all of this. Look, if you take the Occam's razor point and all these problems with actual infinites, and you just look at these, you're like, there's so many issues, and there's tons of paradoxes. I mean, Alexander Proust has written tons on this. I mean, there's so many different paradoxes with infinities. You can spend forever on this, and you would, if it's sometimes at 2 a.m, it's not exactly a page turner. You'll be falling asleep if you can't use another sleeping pill or something. You will pass out. I mean, they just go on and on and on. These paradoxes that you find. And so, I mean, with all of these paradoxes that are hard to solve with actual infinities existing in time, space, and matter, and then you combine that with Occam's razor, just as a cumulative case, it seems very philosophically unlikely that the past is infinity and beyond. Very unlikely. And then, so you have a stopping point. And the question is, what kind of stopping point is that? And then there's other arguments we'll get into later where you can say, okay, is that stopping point going to be a person? Well, if it's all of physical time and space, which is what we're talking about here, if it's a start of that, then it's got to be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of immense power. And so, or you could not have to argue for that last attribute there. You could say, like, it's a personal being, and we all have an idea of what a disembodied agent is. We know what it means when I say, like, I could have an afterlife, I could survive the death of my body, disembodied spirits, angels, demons. I mean, there's even atheists that believe in demons I've encountered, So the general humanity has believed in disembodied spirits, so there's nothing wrong about postulating that as a possible candidate when there aren't any other good candidates. I mean, like, what if you were to say like an immaterial thing, like a number like 1 would cause it? That wouldn't make any sense, So you'd want to go with a disembodied a soul or spirit to cause it, which we would call God, as Aquinas would put it, and you would argue for that, and you would argue if it was just a physical object. Well, I think these arguments cut against a physical object, but if it's a material thing, it makes the most sense, because then you could explain the entire shooting match. You can explain the entire dominoes, why they're there is because a necessary disembodied agent was there, a being that has to exist. And that explains all of these philosophical problems as to why there is something rather than nothing. Well, there has to be something, namely God. So that's another argument we're going to get into, but I'm going to go to the scientific arguments and kind of make an argument for this being God from these scientific arguments. So they are not just philosophical. The scientific arguments, like if you don't like all the Zeno's paradox stuff and all this infinite stuff, you can just stick with a scientific consensus on this. You can just go with what it says here, and just, and this is pretty much adequate for most people. So here's the scientific line, is that the majority of scientists have discovered that the cosmos began to exist. So the atheist idea that, the universe is just eternal, past eternal, that does not make much sense. And so there are many features of the universe that point to this, and we're going to look at this, the expansion. And there was a recent theorem that really kind of proved this beginning of the universe with expansion. That's the Borde-Guth-Langton theory, who I mentioned Langton previously. He denies the first because he thinks the second is true, that the universe began to exist. And so this proves that any universe that is expanding began to exist, even if you include a multiverse. And so this is how Alexander Langton summarizes his findings in this theorem. He says, "It is said that an argument is what convinces a reasonable man, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." So there is no escape. That's how clear it is. I find it interesting. I watch a lot of YouTube atheists, and they're like, oh yeah, the scientific evidence is so unclear. And for evolution, they're like, it's so clear. It's like all these problems with evolution that people can't solve. Oh, but no, then they'll start, when it comes to evolution, it's like the skeptical dial's like so low. But when they go to like the Big Bang, it's like all of a sudden their skeptical dial starts increasing. I find that quite interesting and amusing. Barrow and Tipler remark about this. He says, at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally nothing existed before this singularity. So if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have creation ex nihilo, which is what Genesis 1:1 says, I believe. So what are the two just major factors in deciding this whole thing? Well, there's a lot I can mention, but I'll just kind of summarize it so we can kind of button this thing up here. But the first major line of evidence is that this is coming from the second law of thermodynamics, that unless energy is being fed into a system, that system will become increasingly disordered. And so what scientists have realized is that the second law pointed to a very grim prediction about the future of the universe, assuming Jesus doesn't come back, right? But on the naturalistic view, what would happen? Energy will eventually spread itself out evenly throughout the entire universe. The universe will become a featureless soup with no more life or any possibility of life there. This is called the so-called heat death of the universe. The universe will reach this at a finite amount of time. This is heat death. But if we had an infinite amount of time, we would already be in the heat. We would be in a cold, dead, lifeless universe, right? But we're obviously here alive. We're not, it's not millions and millions of years have just, transpired. We're here. And so because we're alive, we know the heat death hasn't occurred. We know the past is not infinite. If an infinite amount of time was in the past, the heat death would already have arrived. We would already be dead if there was an infinite past. It would have already run out of energy. We would be in a cold, dead, lifeless universe. We are in no such universe, so therefore the heat death hasn't happened, giving evidence that the past is not infinite, going on back and back and back. Second line of evidence that has been verified from our telescopes in the past 80 years, and this is an obvious point of data, the universe is expanding. The universe is expanding, and if you play the tape backwards and you just play it back and back, and then you go to a point where you have a very small singularity that exploded and expanded, and this is known as the Big Bang, if you just kind of roll back the clock on that. And this is how physicist P.C.W. Davies, this is what he says. If we extrapolate this prediction to its extreme, we reach a point when the distances in the universe have shrunk to zero. An initial cosmological singularity, therefore, forms a past temporal extremity to the universe. We cannot continue physical reasoning or even the concepts of space-time through such an extremity. For this reason, most cosmologists think of the initial singularity as the beginning of the universe. On this view, the Big Bang represents the creation event, the creation not only of all matter and energy in the universe, but of space-time itself. This is how Sir Arthur Eddington put it. He said, contemplating the beginning of the universe, he said that the expansion of the universe was so preposterous and incredible that I feel almost indignation that anyone should believe it, except for myself. He finally felt forced to conclude. He didn't want to conclude it, didn't want to believe it. The atheist's predisposition is to try to hold to other theories that try to make the universe past eternal. The beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it frankly as supernatural. Supernatural. This is what quantum cosmologist Christopher Isom says. He says, perhaps the best argument in favor for the thesis that the Big Bang supports theism is the obvious unease with which it is greeted by some atheist physicists. At times, this had led to scientific ideas such as continuous creation or an oscillating universe being advanced with the tenacity that which so exceeds their intrinsic worth. There's hardly any confirmation of a steady state model. It's very grim. Far exceeds their intrinsic worth that one can only suspect the operation of psychological forces lying very much deeper than the usual academic desire of theorists to support his or her theory. And so I remember hearing that before he passed, Stephen Hawking said at USC, I'm from Southern California, so I heard this from a friend, but he said at USC he was trying to avoid the Big Bang because it was just too theological. I found that so interesting. He was trying to avoid it. He didn't want to face it. He was trying to get away from it, but this is what he admitted. He said almost everyone, now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. So yeah, majority of scientists grant this. According to Hawking, almost everyone believes the universe began to exist. So we got 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. You've got pretty good philosophical reasons when you combine them together. Seems plausible. I'm not saying that all the philosophical arguments are like so clear and so obvious. They can be a little convoluted at times, I think. But I think when you look at the data, it seems like actual infinites cause more problems. It's simpler to hold to a finite pass. So yeah, the universe began to exist, number 2. 3, therefore the universe has a cause. So, okay, so we got to look at the nature of this cause, given the data we just looked at. So how do we do an analysis of what the cause is? Well, it has to be a transcendent supernatural cause, because it transcends the universe, because it caused the universe. It's a cause of the universe, so it's above and beyond the universe. It's supernatural. It's transcendent. So it's getting pretty close here, right? So if time began to exist and it caused time, the Lord caused time, let's say, right? So it would have to be timeless. Cause, time, space, matter, and energy. It itself cannot be comprised of time, space, matter, and energy, because it caused those things at the Big Bang. They began to exist. So the thing that caused it can't be those things. So it has to be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, supernatural, transcendent cause of immense power to expand the finely tuned universe the way that the Big Bang expanded out. And so, yeah, now people say, well, it doesn't prove you can pray to it. I was watching a debate with William Lane Craig. I believe it was against Stephen Law. It was so interesting. So Stephen Law was an atheist, and he granted this argument. And he's like, well, that proves, he doesn't prove that, you pray to it and that it's good, And it's like, well, you're an atheist granting a personal supernatural cause. Man, I don't even think you're an atheist anymore, dude. Maybe you need to give that up. But it was so fascinating to watch it, him grant this argument, it kind of for the purpose of the debate. But now, why I think it's personal. Now, there's going to be other arguments I'm going to give that'll establish other attributes of God. But I think if you're believing in a personal, supernatural, transcendent cause, it's timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, you're probably not an atheist anymore. So you're probably a theist at this point. So there's that. So why I think it's personal. I offer 3 reasons. If you look at Bill Craig, he'll give similar reasons. I find these reasons more clear. Some of the reasons he gives, and citing Swinburne, I don't find as clear. But these seem clear to me, especially when I combine them together in a cumulative case. They seem like, okay, seems like that cause is going to be personal. As I think about it, as I reflect upon the evidence, yeah, it's going to be a personal cause. All right. So first is the expansion of the universe, it's more than 1 in a million. It's like 1 in a billion. I mean, the way it expanded made it possible for life. If it expanded any slower, any faster, the way that the initial singularity expanded out, any slower, any faster, 1 in a billion here kind of thing, more than that actually, then we wouldn't exist here. There'd be no life. So the expansion rate of the universe was so finely tuned for there to be life that, as we see it today, it's very improbable that we're here. And so that suggests intentionality behind the cause, which only persons can have intentionality. There was an intention behind its expansion rate. Secondly, as you think about it, the first cause, what we have here is this timeless, immaterial, transcendent, supernatural being that has power. And so we're not going to say, okay, it's immaterial. Well, there's agents, disembodied agents, or it can be a number. Those are like immaterial things. Numbers are not physical, they're material. Laws of logic, those are called abstract objects. Obviously, the number 2 doesn't make me raise my hand, that would be absurd. Numbers don't cause anything, so it can't be an abstract object. Well, we're all pretty acquainted with, I believe, disembodied agents. Most societies believe in that. Most people believe in disembodied agents. Even atheists believe in disembodied agents. People think it's at least possible that you can survive the death of your body. Thinks that angels and demons are at least possible, or ghosts are just possible. You're not saying you have to believe them or you grant evidence, but they're at least possible. They're not like a contradiction. They're not like saying there's a square circle in Texas or something like that, or 1 + 1 = 3. They're possible. They're possible things. And so given that these are possible things that most people believe, I think the best reasonable candidate Christianity, we're going to want to put it here at the start of the universe, starting the dominoes, is a disembodied personal agent. And I think lastly, what we have here is this agent, this timeless agent chose, or at least they created in time. It could have had a timeless cause. It could have just been a static cause from all eternity past. But why is it that it's you have this kind of intentionality of it being in time, the cause and space being in time and having a succession of moments causing time? Why did it choose to cause things in time? And you combine that with the expansion rate, you combine that with, we have a pretty good grasp of what a disembodied agent is. I think all those considerations would lead me to say, yeah, this is a disembodied, supernatural personal agent that caused the dominoes to start. This is what caused the beginning of the universe. And so I think this is pretty likely here. I think this is a decent argument. Now, I believe there's stronger arguments for God's existence, but I have to be honest, this is the most popular and beloved argument of many people, and so I hope I did it some good justice tonight. And next time we'll be looking at a different argument. But before I talk about that, any questions? Anybody, you can step up to the microphone here and you can ask me anything that you were just confused about, that didn't make sense to you, something I said, you want deeper clarification or you want a greater explanation of something. Oh, we have a brave soul coming up here.
All right, is it working? Okay. So there's some questions that I've actually gotten text from some friends, basically, and they were just curious how you get around, like some people will say that the Kalam is a form of special pleading, I guess, is kind of a common objection. And another common objection that I've actually personally heard that I'm curious just how you would respond to is that basically, and you might have covered it, but I just missed it, that quantum mechanics, specifically Lawrence Krauss, I think that's his name, will say that things do come from nothing, and that nothing is actually, there is such a thing as nothing in like some sort of substance. And so I'm just wondering what you'd say.
So if you look into Lawrence Krauss's writings, you're going to find that nothing, he means like, he means something. He means like, quantum stuff, quantum vacuum, stuff like that. And say that quantum mechanics would show that things can come out of nothing. Well, it just shows that actually they're indeterminate causes. So it comes from something. The quantum energy, right? Particles come from the energy. And so they come from something, but people would say like, oh, they're indeterminate, but that doesn't mean they come from nothing. And then there's deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics, which I tend to hold to the more Bohmian deterministic interpretation of that. So that I don't think it's a really good objection at all. So it's not a legitimate example coming out of nothing. It's not what it's talking about indeterministic causes, and I take it a different interpretation of quantum mechanics that would be deterministic. So
cool. And then how do you what would you say to someone that just claims that this argument's special pleading?
Are you referring to the special pleading that the universe, we need a cause for the universe, but not a cause for God? That kind of stuff?
Yeah. So, well, it's basically that, like, I think the way some philosophers take it is that why would you give special and unique properties? Like, you kind of, like, you're unnecessarily exempting God from certain things and just kind of, like, allowing him to, something like that. Basically, it's like an unfair exemption, and you're not looking at the other facts.
That's usually with regard to, so we're saying the universe needs a cause, but God doesn't need a cause, is usually how that goes. And so what I would say to that is the first premise. Read it carefully. If people a lot of people will say this, like, well, and we actually got this in the YouTube comments, by the way. Not the YouTube comments, the Facebook comments. Got to get my social media platforms right. So we actually got this one, and it says, well, what caused God? Why does he get the free lunch from this? And just the first premise: whatever begins to exist as a cause. We don't think God began to exist. So now, why think that? You say, well, you're tailoring the first premise just to fit God in there. You theist, you're trying to calculate, kind of thing. Well, no, I just think it's intuitively obvious that if it doesn't begin to exist, it doesn't need a cause. I think that's, even David Hume thinks that's reasonable. So that's just formulated based on people's plausibility structure, and they don't like that God fits into that category and the universe doesn't, because they used to say the universe went on forever and ever and didn't need a cause. And now that it's a Big Bang and we got all this stuff, they're like, well, wait a minute, why are you doing that to God? It's like, well, you always did that with the universe anyways. So that's kind of, I think this is plausibly structured, independent of God, and I think that in terms of like, I'm just breaking this in to just kind of get God in the conclusion. No, I think it's an intuitive principle on its own, in its own right. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Everybody else got it? We're all good? Nobody else got any questions? Yeah, you want to come up here? Yeah. So you can be forever on the live stream. Just kidding with you.
I will say, as far as it goes with the exemption that he was just talking about, where God is infinite and doesn't have a cause, that sort of thing is also why I can believe that the universe could be infinite, because there are multiple infinities in that sort. Like if you start at 0 and go 0 point, there's an infinite number between 0 and 1. But if you start with 1, 2, 3, there's also infinite numbers counting that way, which is why I don't necessarily lean away from God just being infinite among infinities like that.
Okay, so that's interesting. So there's two thoughts I would have to that. First is that you still get the science problem. You got the problem with science, right? So that, I could just say, yeah, and I could just say also this argument sucks and don't worry about it. It's not a good argument. I have 49 more, so don't worry. If you don't like this one, just give it up. That's why it's nice having 50 arguments. But in the second place, you got the science. I can give up all those philosophical arguments and say they're trash. I could just say they're not good. I don't think they are. I think they're pretty good, but whatever, If you don't like them, it's okay. But I could give up those. We still got the scientific problem, irrespective of that, right? We still have that issue of the beginning of the universe and the evidence there. So we're still facing that. And then the point you made, it was about between numbers. There's an infinite amount of numbers. Is that kind of what was it again?
So if you start at 0 and go 0.000, there's an infinite number between 0 and 1, same as counting 1, 2, 3, all the way to infinity.
Right, just like I was saying here, there's an infinite amount of points between here. And so each number, there's an infinite amount of points too. But I would say that you'd never reach those. You would never reach an infinite amount of points. You can all your life, or for billions of years, count in between 1 or 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. You see what I'm saying? You can do that, but you'll never arrive at infinity. You'll never arrive at it. And so it's potentially infinite, that you're counting it. So you're not actually ever arriving at infinity. That's the thing. Now, could someone count it? Well, if there was an infinite past, there could. But that's the question, is there an infinite past? So I don't know if that helps. You want to come back on that? Or
Starting to make a little more sense. Just one of those that kind of always had a few extra questions about. So getting a good explanation like that is very good to hear.
Good, yeah. Well, thanks for asking good questions. Yeah, definitely. Everybody else good here? We're feeling the love? It's all good? Okay, good deal. Well, next week, we hope the weather is more forgiving next week, because we like it's church. We like forgiveness here, Oh, we got a new one. All right, well, let's bring it on up then. It's not about unicorn. Well, you can go to the microphone so people on the live stream can hear. Because there's evidently a lot of people on the live stream with the snow problem we've had. I made it out. I'm Californian, but, I almost got killed a few times, just to be clear. No, I'm just kidding.
So Perrin Pollard says, he says this is similar to Neil deGrasse Tyson's objection. He claims that if there are different sizes of infinities, 1, 2, and 2 and 4, we could imagine that one planet could infinitely I guess this wasn't necessarily a question, but he basically, so this is to reiterate what you're saying, that basically other physicists agree with you on the fact that you can't have actual infinites in the universe. And so, but another kind of interesting thing is that, so actually this is kind of a question that I've had. How do you deal with a multiverse kind of situation?
Yeah, so the philosophical arguments handle that one too, but also the scientific ones, because in the multiverse you always have there's some expansion going on, and that's still the Borg-Guth-Langton theory applies to that, and so you're done on that. Okay. So you got both the scientific arguments for that, and you have the philosophical, and of course you can always go with Occam's razor and say it's an infinitely complex theory. So go with a simpler theory. You can do that too. All right. There's a lot of different ways you can respond to the multiverse, but I mean, it's not a lot of evidence for it, So that's another thing, other than just postulating it to avoid God. But then there's they kind of would say, as they're putting it out, this is really interesting. For multiverses, they have a finely tuned multiverse generating machine. Then you want to ask who made that machine, finely tuned.
Right. Is there any issue with Guth denying the second premise, right? I think you said.
He might be holding to a different theory that tries to avoid like expansion, or might be trying to modify a different theory. The one that I can't remember the gentleman's name. It's escaped. I saw the debate live. I was live there in person. But there are some models that are not attractive, that have theoretical problems, like Boltzmann brains and stuff like that, that have huge issues making sense of just basic perceptions and reality, that people are willing to embrace to avoid this. But it's such a minority position, and this is the most evidence position, that they're not viable in terms of the evidence.
Right. So. And then
he would probably try to avoid at that time when he said that. And by the way, I believe actually that quote in that, which I did what you're doing, I went up and asked on the microphone, which is ironic, in that debate. I was out there in Louisiana. So Craig, they went back and they found that clip he took of Guth was taken out of context, and that Guth was not affirming what he said he was affirming. So that was actually the real answer. And Craig didn't know that.
Right.
So he found out later.
And then with Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, actually. So even though he denies actual infinites, some physicists do too, or astrophysicists. Yeah. They still don't find God as a plausible explanation, especially when it comes to like the Kalam. Why do you think that?
It's an excessive focus on naturalism. People say the God of the gaps, but there's naturalism of the gaps, kind of thing. Like, like Quentin Smith said, the most plausible explanation is the universe came by nothing and from nothing, for nothing. Interestingly enough, he became a theist on the basis of another argument later on in his life, but that's another point. But that's what he said. That's the most plausible thing he believes as an atheist. The universe came from nothing and by nothing and for nothing. And so it's just like anything you can to avoid that. And so people come up with any theory they can. So it's like a naturalism of the gaps. Anything I can say to get out of this God alternative, because I don't want to believe in a personal transcendent being that caused, So I would say that has kind of that bias in check. And so people want to, and I think people look around and they see physical objects and they just think very crassly about things, right? So everything's physical, so I must put everything physical into the past. I must come up with any physical explanation I can, even though it philosophically and scientifically doesn't make any sense. So I think people feel that way about physical objects, so anything will be physical at that point. I think it's a very human thing to do. So I think that's part of it. I don't want to psychologize too much about them and say they'll have bad intentions and motives or something like that. But I mean, I've talked to a philosophy professor that once told me that, and I said well, don't you think ghosts are possible? Don't you think that demons are possible? Well, I'm not sure if I think demons and angels are possible. Yeah, but you think it's possible that you can do divine psychology on an infinite being about whether or not he has reasons for preventing certain horrible events or whatever it is. And so that's interesting. They think that God couldn't have a good reason. They can do divine psychology on an infinite being they don't think exists. But they can't but they can't grant the possibility of angels and demons and stuff like that when most of humanity has granted that as plausible. So, yeah, I guess I lost track. What was your original question? Sorry.
It was just kind of surrounded around the idea of infinity.
Oh, that's right. Why people just and that's why is they're just. I think there's other motives and desires going on to avoid God, and I think people like physical things. They want to put physical things in there. They like that kind of scientific, that sort of scientism, for lack of a better word, which people don't believe in scientism with regard to morality. Morality is not a scientific fact. It's an ethical fact. And so they like anything they see and touch. They want to give primacy to that, even though there's not good philosophical reasons for thinking everything is physical. I think that's my best charitable take on that.
Okay.
So,
yeah, makes sense.
For what it's worth.
Cool.
So.
Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, you bet. So, going once, going twice. Right? Okay, very good. Well, as I said last time, we're going to be looking at, I've decided to follow Jesus. No, I have, but I've decided to go over the argument from consciousness next, I guess it would be next month. So this is the last Wednesday of every month. We go over the argument from consciousness, which, as we're going to see, that the arguments that they're independently powerful, but they mutually support each other. So as we get more arguments, they kind of pile up. They're going to pile up, and so making the case for theism more and more plausible. Thank you all for coming out on a snowy, dangerous evening. I appreciate it. Let's close with a word of prayer. God, we are thankful we can come out. I pray that every person here gets home safely on those roads, and that you would, if there's somebody who has not trusted in you, Jesus, that you'd work in their hearts to receive you as their Lord and Savior for the forgiveness of all of their sins, and that they would come to know your love and your grace and your mercy, Jesus. We are thankful that you brought us here this evening to discuss the most important question, whether or not God exists. Thank you for blessing our time. It's in Christ and we pray. Amen.